The poem, Can You Hear My Voice, does not provide the answer, but time and again, Jewish tradition affirms that when we call out, God listens and responds. Perhaps the most potent demonstration of this motif is found in the middle of this week's parashah, this week's Torah portion, Vayera. This week's Torah portion concerns the continuing adventures of Abraham, Sarah, and their family. And perhaps among its most famous passages, I'd have to say the most famous passage is the last chapter of the parashah, where Abraham is called to bind his son Isaac on the altar, the binding of Isaac's story, which is read on Rosh Hashanah. But just a few chapters before that is a passage that is deservedly no less famous, where God, having promised to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, filled as they are with wickedness, lawlessness, greed, and corruption, Abraham steps forward and has the holy audacity, the Chutzpah klapei shamayim, the chutzpah directed toward the heavens, toward God, to say, shall the judge of all the earth not act justly? If you find even 50 innocent people in these cities, will you not spare them? And God says, for the sake of 50, I will spare. But Abraham, being both Jewish and audacious and chutzpahdik, does not stop at 50. He says, I beg your pardon, but let me ask again, what about for 40? And God says, for the sake of 40, I will spare the cities. And on this negotiation goes all the way down to 10. Should I find 10 innocent people in the cities, I will spare them on behalf of the innocent. This is one of the most powerful demonstrations of the Jewish voice raised even against authority. And ever since Abraham, our people have continued to empower the voice of the people. I know that it feels like old news now that we've had our own American midterm elections just this past week, but a very consequential national election was held in Israel on Tuesday, November 1st. And because Israel is a robust democracy where each and every day, not only on election day, and yes, it does seem like each and every day in Israel is an election day. This, I believe, was the 5th national election in 4 years. Each and every day, the voice of the people throughout Israel is heard. Israel is a democracy, and the people have made their votes known and counted. And now we're at a very interesting outcome. So to share a little bit about how the elections work, where we're at right now, how we got there, and what the results may portend for Israel and for, of course, the Jewish people as a collective. Delighted to invite back to it seems like we do this a lot, Yoel, just because there's so many elections. Every time Israel has had an election recently, I've been blessed to have my friend Yoel Magid join me for some conversation and talking points about these elections. So I think, Yoel, we're going to make sure that this guy is on. There you go. And all right, so we have a screen, right? I have to put the screen down. Isn't that right, Zoe? Okay. Screen down. Ooh, so cool. This is part of our new high-tech apparatus. Do I need to hit projector on? You got it? Beautiful. Okay.
Do the other slide first.
Here, stand in front of the mic, y'all.
Do the other slide first, please.
Flip slides. Perfect.
Okay, so we're talking about high tech. Everyone knows Israel is a startup nation, but we're amazing in our high tech. We're all very proud of Israelis' achievements. But how do Israelis vote? We've been watching voting going on in this country, and conservatives standing behind glass walls watching. So I'll start with a story about when I was an observer in Ashkelon, a city in Israel, and we had to check people's identity cards. Some of them were carrying identity cards that were 40 years old before they had long beards, when they still had long hair, and it was very hard to figure out if they were real people or not. Talking about fake votes or not, but everyone voted. And what they would do to vote is they would go behind a screen. And behind the screen, there was an enormous box. And in the box, there were these initials. Each box had, in this election, there were 40 parties running. Each box had the letters of a party. So that's how you voted. You took a piece of paper, one of those initials. You had to learn that beforehand to know which party it was, because there was a fight sometimes about which party got what initials. Some of them have maintained the same initials for all the years, for 30, 40 years already. You put it in an envelope and that's your vote. Your vote would be disqualified if at the time they were counting there were two pieces of paper in the envelope, because that would be trying to cheat, vote twice. So it was only if you had one piece of paper in. And then the votes were counted in this kind of way. The different letters were spread out on the table, and they were put through a little metal pole and then were counted. As they were counted, with all the observers watching, standing over the shoulders of people. We weren't behind the glass wall. Okay, so that's how the Israeli election is run. It's not high tech. There are no computers involved, and then each individual polling place has to report by telephone, and today it's probably by computer, into the central office in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, wherever it is today, where they're all tabulated, where the results of them are all added up to see which party got how many votes. Can we move to the second slide now? So Israel is a country of many parties. It started with Ben-Gurion, who wanted Israel to be as democratic as possible, and he said everyone should have the right to run an election. And that was a little extreme, but what happened was that you needed only 1% of the vote to get elected to the Knesset. 1% would get you one seat, maybe, in the 120-seat Knesset, although you need a little more than 1%. And over the years, that increased to 3.25%. So the threshold now is 3.25% to be elected to the Knesset. And any party, anyone can go and list his party as long as he signs a few documents and proves that he's a citizen and believes in the state of Israel. Anyone can run. That's why we get so many parties. We have minority parties that didn't get in, who got a few hundred votes. There was one party that was an anti-vaxxer party. There was another party that's very traditional that's called the Green Leaf Party, which is a marijuana party. And they get 1,000, 1,500 votes every election. There was another party called the Pirates Party. Nobody knows what they believe in, but they chose as their initial in Hebrew, Pei Kof Sofi, which in Israel would be the same as FK. So they were expressing their opinion about the whole system. There were 2 youth parties running this year. None of them got in, okay? So to get in, you needed 3.25%, which turned out 70% of the Israelis, 71% almost voted. That too is an interesting statistic, because that includes 70% of all Israelis who have the right to vote. That includes me. I'm an Israeli citizen as well as an American citizen. But Israelis are not allowed to vote abroad, so I can't vote. Twice, since I've come back to the States, I've flown to Israel to vote, but it's a pretty expensive proposition with 5 elections in a couple of years. So I haven't done that for a long time. So the parties advertise themselves for 3 weeks before the election. It's limited, so that's a good thing about the election things. And people have these flags hanging outside of their houses with the initial of the party on. That's how they show their support. What happened this year, and the surprising result, which I think might surprise you, is that there was no difference in the votes this year and in the last election. 50% of the vote voted for pro-Bibi parties, and 50% voted anti-Bibi parties. The difference was that there were a few parties who didn't make this 3.25% cutoff point, the threshold. One of them was an old leftist party, Meretz, and they got 3.16%. They were 3,000 votes short of getting into the Knesset. If they had gotten into the Knesset, 3.25% means 4 seats. That would have changed the whole picture. One of the Arab parties, and there were 4 Arab parties running this year, one of the Arab parties missed by 20,000 votes or 18,000 votes. So they didn't get in either. The total number of wasted votes was 8.7%. In other words, 8.7% of the population that voted for parties that didn't make it into Knesset. That's a lot of wasted votes, and that's a record. It was never this high before. So what happened was that fewer parties got elected, and we can see on this slide that 10 parties out of the 40 that were running got into the Knesset. Bibi won, the Likud, the biggest party, won with 32 votes, but that's not enough. Israel is a parliamentary system, so you need a majority to be elected prime minister. You're elected by the Knesset. By the way, when you vote for a party, if you ask anyone who's voting, they will probably know the first name on the list of the party they're voting for and the second party. You don't vote for individuals, you vote for a party. So when you vote for a party, you might be voting for people you never even heard of. It's a crazy system.
And then each party has its list or its slate of people who will sit in the Knesset proportionally. So in Likud, Bibi is seat number 1, which means that if Likud is the party with the greatest number of seats, Bibi gets the first seat. And then down the line, but it gets cut off. If you're seat number 33 in Likud, sorry, you don't sit in the Knesset.
There was even an election about 20 years ago where the party did so much better than it expected. They didn't have enough people on their list. They had after the election to add party names to the list in order to cover the amount of votes they got. They were so surprised. So the results of this election, which are so upsetting to so many American Jews and Israeli Jews and people around the world, and we'll get into that in a little bit, were that Bibi was supported by 4 parties. His own party, the Likud, which was the largest party, and then by 3 Orthodox, 2 of them ultra-Orthodox parties. The ultra-Orthodox parties received 11 and 7 votes, so they received 18 seats in the Knesset, okay? And the new party that everyone's really upset about, headed by a guy named Ben-Gvir, whom we'll talk about in a while, we'll have to, got 14 seats. That was Bibi's greatest political success because he had convinced 3 small religious parties to merge together and run under one name. This is the way you get above it, because he was worried that one of them wouldn't get above the 3.25%. So by coercing them, convincing them to run together, he succeeded in getting them, and they succeeded much more than he thought. Okay? The ultra-Orthodox parties succeeded beyond their own expectations and their wildest dreams. Why? Because the outgoing government in Israel was made up of 10 different parties, including an Arab party, which was very shocking for a lot of them, but it also had a conservative Jewish bent to it, a modern Orthodox bent to it, and they changed the laws of kashrut a bit. They cut down on the subsidies for yeshiva students, and a whole series of issues that really upset the ultra-Orthodox. So they got their vote out. If 70% of the Israelis, of the total of Israelis voted, it was probably 85 or 90% of the ultra-Orthodox who voted. So they got more than representation. Arabs, who represent 20% of the Israeli population, got only 10 seats in the Knesset. They didn't even get 10%. Why? Because one party failed, because they weren't unable, because of ego issues, to merge together, as they did in the last election, where they ran under the joint list. So they got kicked out, that one party, and that wasted a lot of votes. So if you're trying to understand the results of the election, the results are based on an electoral system in Israel that's very different from anything we're familiar with here.
And if you see just how the math is going to shake out with the coalition, it will be Likud with 32 plus the Religious Zionist Party. That's the one that merged under, we'll talk about the character who's leading that, and then Shas and United Torah Judaism 11 and 7 seats respectively. That gives you 64, which is a clear majority. Out of the 120 seats in the Knesset, 61 is a simple majority. Anything above that is more than a majority. This is not a super majority, but it's a strong coalition that will allow Bibi to return to power as prime minister. And I think the most interesting thing about this, and Yoel and I were talking earlier in the week, is that this is a real head spinner, but Bibi is now going to be among the most moderate figures in his government. By far, actually. And one of the functions that Bibi is now expected to play is, I would call him like the lock or the latch on the door of religious extremism and extreme nationalism, which is the kind of the ilk of his bedfellows. Right? So Likud is actually much more moderate in some ways. I know that seems strange to those of us who have been conditioned to think of Likud as a hard right-wing party, But when you compare it with the three other coalition bedfellows, Bibi becomes the moderator and will have to work hard to hold this coalition together, given the fact that we expect, and we'll talk about this, that some of the legislative agenda items of his coalition partners will be viewed by Bibi and his Likudniks as fairly extreme and maybe not good for what he wants Israel to be.
Okay, well, just one more thing about the system with respect to the Orthodox parties. So there's Shas, which is an Orthodox Mizrahi party, a Sephardic party, that attracts lots of non-Orthodox votes of Mizrahi Jews. And then there's the Jewish Torah party, which is a merger of I don't know how many different groups because each rabbi has his own following. So when they make up the list that Rabbi Blake described, the slate, who's first, who's second, who's third, they have these week-long arguments about who's going to be first, second, third, which rabbi gets the kavod, the honor of being where on the list. If they had run separately, they wouldn't have gotten into the Knesset, just like Meretz didn't get into the Knesset. But by merging them together into one list, they were able to get enough votes to get 7 seats in the Knesset. But if you figure it's 3 parties that was involved in that, and you've divided it up, they might not have made it otherwise. So, who's elected and what do they believe in? That's what the really interesting stuff is. It's important to understand this background. Don, do you want to start with?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'd actually like to phrase this a little bit in the form of a question. I'd rather ask you first, so why did Israel vote for Likud in such numbers? And let's go back to the party that still got the biggest number of votes. And why is Bibi, who continues to be under indictment, still perceived to be such a strong and compelling leader for Israel? Get inside the mind of an Israeli who doesn't think like Yoel is really the challenge here.
Okay, the Likud is fairly stable in its support, and like certain American politicians who appeal to certain kinds of people, they have a very solid base. And the base comes out for them, and the base, I talked about Shas, the Mizrahi party, the base is to a large part made of 2 very different kinds of groups. One is Mizrahi Jews, who were very angry about how they were treated when their parents and grandparents came to Israel and were DDT'd by the Labor Party. They were sprayed because they were all suspect of being diseased.
These are Jews who were refugees from Arab lands, Mizrahi, literally of the East.
And then there's the traditional right-wing ideological parties of the right that supported the Likud all the years. So, and they've been fairly steady. What I didn't say before, though, is that almost every party, it's hard to describe it as left and right anymore. The elections in these last 5 elections have all been pro-Bibi or anti-Bibi. Why do I say that? Because almost the heads of 4 or 5 of these parties that are running against Bibi, running independently, were all formerly members of the Likud. And they ran away from the Likud because they said Bibi lied to them too much, Bibi cheated them, he tricked them. Bibi is a master politician. He's very successful, as we know. He's gotten elected enough times to show that. But he's also a nasty political leader who knows how to stab people in the back and to get rid of any opposition he had within the party. So people didn't trust him. His own people didn't trust him and left the Likud. I think the greatest irony of this election and the past elections is that if Bibi weren't there, the right wing would have won overwhelmingly. Because a lot of the people from the right wing who moved to the center only because they hated Bibi. Lieberman, the head of the Russian party, and we didn't even mention the Jewish Home Party, believes in almost everything Bibi believes in terms of how you should treat Arabs or how Israel should look, except for the religious side, because the Russians are very upset by the religious laws that impede them, don't let them get married even sometimes because they have to prove they're Jewish, and all sorts of other things that really get them upset. But he was Bibi's senior aide. Bennett, the last prime minister before Lapid, was Bibi's senior aide. Ayelet Shaked, who ran in a separate party that also didn't get in, was 3rd in Bibi's list once in terms of supporting him, but she antagonized Bibi's wife and she was written off. So you have a whole series of personal ego kinds of issues in which people have betrayed or left the Likud. So the Likud is still a strong party, still attracts votes, but it didn't attract more than, it hasn't been able to build its strength stronger than that. And people fled more to the ultra-Orthodox or to this new party, which is this merger of three parties, which I think we should talk about, because they're the ones that are upsetting us, most of us the most.
Right. So, in terms of the people who are cheering this, some of them are making their vote because of Bibi's personal magnetism, because of the way in which Bibi has curried favor with the Mizrahi parties, with those who are of Arab descent, meaning coming from the Arab Middle East in their ancestry, which is very broad. I mean, it goes all the way from Morocco to Afghanistan. Bibi is also seen as strong on Iran's ambitions of regional hegemony and sponsorship of terror in the region. And Bibi can vote on, or Bibi can campaign on his track record of having avoided or minimized conflict, foreign conflict, war. Those are things that I think appeal to Bibi voters. But I think it's also important that we get a little bit into just who's going to be vexed, troubled, or deeply unsettled by this election in Israel. I mean, we can talk about what this means for the American Jewish community and the American Reform community in particular. But in order to do that, just a few minutes, Yoel, could you just share a couple words about that merger of the three and who the figure at the head of that alliance is?
Okay. Before that, one more sentence on the ultra-Orthodox parties. They won 18 seats in the Knesset, but not one woman is on their list because they won't allow women to run. So that's important to remember. So this coalition that Bibi is going to build, it's 18 of the ultra-Orthodox, 14 of this religious Zionist party, it's called the religious party, and another 5 or 6 Orthodox members of Likud. 40 of the 64 members of the Knesset, of the coalition that's going to be running the country until the next election, are very Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. Let me put it that way. Now, this new party that emerged this year, this merger of three parties, it's led by a guy whose name is Ben Gvir. He was not allowed to serve in the Israeli army because he was too extreme and they were afraid to give him a gun. I'm not exaggerating. He had in his living room of his house a picture of Baruch Goldstein. You remember who that is? He slaughtered 29 Arabs who were praying in a cave. He went in with a machine gun and killed them all until the ones who were alive managed to get
Purim of 1994.
So this was a long time ago. He celebrates every year Kahani's birthday. For those of us, most of us here are old enough to remember who Rabbi Kahani was and how extreme he was in his views and in his racism. Recently, this guy has said, and I'm quoting him indirectly, not directly, but he said things like, disloyal people living in Israel should be deported or relocated. What does that mean? It means, someone asked him, what does disloyal mean? He said, well, if you throw a firebomb, you're disloyal. Okay, that I buy. If you throw stones, you should, that's disloyalty. He completely forgot that the stone throwing started in the religious community against the police. And he's certainly not going to deport any of them or come critical of them. So it's an anti-Arab statement. He went to a demonstration a week or 2 weeks before the election and pulled out a gun and said to the soldiers they should shoot the Arabs demonstrating. That's the way of quieting Israel down and bringing calm. So he's as extreme as you can get. He's the head of a party that's forming the coalition, so he's going to be in the cabinet. Whether he's going to be Minister of Education, he's hinted at that, because then he could influence the secular education where children aren't educated enough in traditional Judaism. By the way, every Israeli child studies the Bible and Tanakh every year in school, and they have to pass a matriculation exam. It's not that the secular schools don't study it, but he says they're not getting enough, they're having too many liberal teachers. You can associate that with things happening in this country. So that's the level of his extremism. Or he might be in charge of the Defense Department. Can you imagine a guy who wasn't allowed to serve in the army being in charge of the Defense Department, or what we call Homeland Security, public security? This is really frightening stuff. Frightening stuff not only for the Arab community in Israel and on the West Bank, two separate communities, But also for Jews who might disagree with the government and how they'll be treated.
I was going to say there are populations that are concerned in Israel. The LGBTQ population is concerned about religious extremist legislation that will further marginalize them. We do have a lot to celebrate about how Israel treats its LGBTQ community, but it's on a razor's edge. I mean, gay marriage is not legal in Israel, just for your reference. And the LGBTQ community is concerned about their rights being marginalized. Obviously, those who have advocated for the equal place of women in Jewish religious life, equal place of non-Orthodox Judaism, of Reform and Conservative, that's, of course, a core issue for us, Westchester Reform Temple, but our movement, our Reform movement, both here and the Israel movement for Progressive Judaism, which is the Reform movement in Israel, we're going to be very vigilant about potential legislation and action that will infringe on strides toward equality. And I would say also, in addition, of course, to the Arab populations, concerns about further legislation that will privilege Jewish rights over Arab rights. We're not even talking about West Bank Palestinians. We're talking about the 20% of Israeli citizens, passport-holding Israeli citizens who are not Jewish, who are Arab. So there are lots of concerns from those communities. And the last group that I've really been thinking about are those Muslims who are concerned about what's going to happen on what we call the Temple Mount, what they call Haram al-Sharif, the noble, the shrine, the El-Aqsa Mosque, the noble dome, and the Dome of the Rock. There are members of this coalition who have already talked about, wouldn't it be great to build a synagogue on the Temple Mount? Why can't we expand the hours and days of the week when Jews are praying on the Temple Mount? And, for somebody like me, it's not that I'm not about religious equality, it's that I believe that this is all a harbinger of deep unrest, potentially violent unrest, surrounding the Temple Mount and the religious extremism that the Temple Mount has tended to be a lightning rod for that kind of extremism. And these are some of the things that we know legislators who will have a vote and maybe even a ministry in this new government will be concerned with. And there are plenty of others as well. Anything else?
These are things they're talking about. It's not things that we're making up. They're saying it out loud. The second on the list, on Ben Gvir's list, said, "I'm a proud homophobe." He's not denying it or he's not pretending. There's no hypocrisy involved. They're very outward in saying what they believe in and what they want to do, including praying on the Temple Mount. And the one final issue that we didn't mention as a larger issue is the judiciary system in Israel, right, where they also have said they want to pass a law that the Knesset, with a 61-vote majority, can overturn any judicial system and judicial decision made by the Supreme Court. This means that any judge or Supreme Court in Israel that's trying to protect civil rights or the rights of minorities can be overridden by a simple law in the Knesset. It's saying the Supreme Court has no power. It's the end of division of power in Israel in order to perpetuate their own control and their own rules.
And Israel's Supreme Court has done an extraordinary job of standing up for and validating and continuing to enforce the rights of the vulnerable, the minorities, the non-Orthodox, the non-Jewish population of Israel.
And we're very proud that there's an Arab on the Supreme Court, an Israeli Arab on the Supreme Court, and has been for years.
Right, but the view of some of the people who are in power or will be in power in this next coalition is that the Supreme Court has too much power and that it should really be up to the Knesset. I recognize we're kind of at a time boundary tonight. I know I'm sticking around for a little bit at the Oneg, would be happy to take questions. Yoel is far more of a mumche, an expert, than I am, and he would also welcome your engagement around this. I want to make a couple of last things clear. First of all, my gratitude, always, for helping to unpack a very complicated system and actually make it so that anybody, even somebody who has no familiarity at all with how Israeli governments are elected, will come away tonight, I hope, with a deeper understanding, both of how this works and what it means. And I want to say a couple of things just in my role as a rabbi and as a rabbi at Westchester Reformed Temple specifically. One, I am extraordinarily proud of my loyalty to Israel and this congregation, Zionism. I will, God willing, be in Israel in February. And God willing, we will go as a congregation a year from next month. So 13 months till our 70th anniversary WRT celebratory full congregational trip to Israel. I'm very proud of our congregation's strong commitment to Israel, its safety, its security, and its democracy. And I want to make it clear that I really believe, and I would say this about America and our election, I really believe that in recent elections, not just here and not just in Israel, but in so many countries across the world, in the West, in the Middle East, in the Far East, democracy is what is on the line these days. So I began with a little bit of a shout out to Avraham, to Abraham, who had the Chutzpah klapei shamayim, the chutzpah, to say even to the master of the universe, you must act justly. And our temple holds that commitment very seriously as well. So we will be watching, and we will continue to support Israel, but we will also support those organizations and those groups that build and bolster democracy in Israel. And that means standing up for the Reform movement and the non-Orthodox Jewish movements in Israel. That means supporting the voice of people in Israel who are citizens but who are not Jewish. That means recognizing that the situation with Palestinians who are living on the other side of the Green Line in the West Bank is neither morally nor strategically sustainable and must be addressed. We're not going to let go of these issues because we care about Israel in body, we care about its security, we care about Israelis going to sleep at night without the threat of rocket fire over their homes, but we also care about Israel's soul. Right? We care about its neshama. To say so is not an act of diminishing or disparaging Israel. It is an act of patriotic love. And I will go to the mat for that premise any day of the week. I'm very, very grateful to this congregation for supporting the nuanced appraisal of Israel as a modern miracle and a very fragile democracy, the world's only Jewish state that has to be loved and safeguarded. Thank you, Yoel, so very much. Shakoach. Thank you.